Hello and welcome back. This video is an updated and more detailed version of some videos I've made in the past, showing how I use simple hand tools to weld fabrics together to make inflatable boats and accessories. There's also a text version of these instructions on the heat sealing page at DIYPackcraft.com. Let's start with a brief description of how heat sealing works. The DIY Packcraft fabrics are coated with a layer of thermoplastic polyurethane, or TPU, which is a type of airtight and waterproof plastic that will fuse to itself when heated above a particular temperature and pressed together. When done right, these welds are actually stronger than the woven fabric that the TPU is bonded to, so there's no need for additional sewing or gluing. The simplest way to apply heat and pressure is to press the fabric with an iron until the TPU layers begin to melt, and then to remove the iron and continue to press the fabric with a rag or a roller for several seconds to ensure that the fabric pieces don't move apart before the melted TPU cools and fuses into a single layer. Because the TPU is a plastic that melts when it's heated, touching the TPU directly with an iron will cause the TPU to melt and stick to the iron, creating a mess and damaging the airtight waterproof coating. So we can't iron the TPU directly. Instead, we press the iron on the woven side of the fabric and let the heat transfer through the fabric into the TPU layers below. The fabrics can only be welded together when they're oriented so the TPU layers face each other, TPU to TPU. You can always tell which side is which because the uncoated side is a woven fabric while the TPU coated side is a smooth plastic. If you try to weld a TPU-coated fabric to a non-TPU surface, it will stick, but it only makes a weak bond that will come apart over time, so don't try to assemble something that way. Before we move on to talk about heat sealing irons, I'll just mention that when I describe this process, I use different words like heat seal, weld, join, and bond, but the meaning is always the same: to apply heat and pressure to the fabric so the TPU coatings fuse together as I've just described. Now let's talk about heat sealing irons. For some projects you can get away with using a regular clothes iron or a model airplane covering iron like this one. But for most of the DIY Packcraft projects, these are too large to use without accidentally touching areas that you don't want to melt. My preferred heat sealing irons are these leather irons, which you can find on AliExpress.com and sometimes on eBay or Amazon. They're sold under various brand names, but many of them look like they came out of the same factory. To purchase one, just type leather iron into the AliExpress search bar and pick one that looks similar to this, and make sure it has a dial or some other way to adjust the temperature. These leather irons require a few simple modifications before they're useful for heat sealing, and I've made a separate video showing how to do that, so I won't get into it here, but I'll link to that video below. Note that these irons don't turn off by themselves, so I've made myself a little iron on flag that I hang on the doorknob of my workshop whenever I plug in my iron, so I won't forget about it and leave it unattended. I highly recommend that you do the same thing. Also, if your iron didn't come with a stand, you can make one like this out of some scrap sheet metal or even a tin can, because the irons do get hot enough to scorch wood, so you don't want to be setting them down just anywhere. I also find it helpful to clamp the power cord to the edge of my table so the weight of the cord won't pull the iron off the table when I set it down. Speaking of tables, any smooth, heat-resistant work surface will make an adequate workspace. I usually iron over unpainted wood or MDF, and I cover it with parchment paper, which is a silicone-coated baking paper. The parchment paper prevents the fabric from sticking to the wood if I accidentally melt some TPU in an area I didn't intend to. If you're making something as large as a Packcraft, then ideally you'll have a dining room table-sized area to work on. Some people do their heat sealing while sitting on the floor. If you're using something like a dining room table, you don't have to cover the entire surface with heat-resistant material, just the area where you'll be ironing. You can find a small sheet of MDF like this at pretty much any lumberyard or hardware store, and one or two of these will be ideal. I also use dimensional lumber like this for some things. Avoid ironing over rough or uneven surfaces because if you press a flat iron against an uneven surface, then the heat and pressure applied to the fabric will be uneven as well. Corrugated cardboard is a good insulator, but because of the corrugations inside, it's not very good for heat sealing over, because most of the pressure will be focused over the ridges and not over the valleys. If you want to use cardboard to insulate your table, use something like a cereal box that isn't corrugated. Let's talk about the ironing technique. In some of my older videos, you'll see that I used to move the iron back and forth a lot while I was making these welds, trying to press hard at the same time. But I found that it's easier and more precise to hold the iron in one spot and count out roughly 8 to 10 seconds while pressing just hard enough to make sure the heat will flow easily from the iron into the fabric. Then I remove the iron and quickly press hard on that area with a rag or roller for about 5 to 10 seconds until the TPU solidifies, and then I move on to iron the adjacent section of the seam. You can see it kind of wants to lift up just on its own. So if it's hot and you don't press it together while it's cooling, it'll tend to just kind of come apart and it won't be fully welded. The hottest part of the iron is in the middle, so as I iron the next little bit, I always overlap the edge of the new weld over the area that is already welded by about 1 centimeter or half an inch. That way I'm sure there won't be any gaps in the weld, and I should get a good weld all the way along the seam. When pressing on the weld with my rag or roller, I try to push any air bubbles out to the edges, so the first push with the roller is always rolling away from the area that is already welded. Sometimes if there's a large bubble trapped in a weld, I'll reheat that area and press the bubble out to the side of the seam, and then reseal the area. That's really all there is to the ironing technique itself. The rest is just details. The fabrics in the DIY Packraft kits weld at approximately 200 degrees Celsius, which is around 400 degrees Fahrenheit. But I only mention that because so many people ask. Knowing that number doesn't really help you at all, because you can't rely on the numbers on your iron's adjustment dial to set the temperature. To illustrate this point, this particular iron works best when it's set to 350 degrees Celsius, but if that was the actual temperature at the surface of the metal, then the iron would melt right through the fabric. So this iron is much cooler than it indicates. It's literally off by 150 degrees. But some of my customers say that the irons they've received are much hotter than the dial indicates, so the errors aren't consistent. You also can't rely on one of these infrared temperature guns, because they don't work on reflective surfaces like metal. You just get crazy readings that don't make any sense, so don't even bother. You could use one of these thermometers, but it's just another thing to buy, and there's no way to know how accurate it is. Knowing the actual temperature isn't really necessary, because it's really easy to find the right setting, and once you've found it, you can just put a piece of tape over the dial so it won't move. It's also worth mentioning that even though these dials have a linear scale, like if you turn it this much, then it's supposed to increase the temperature by so many degrees, and then if you turn it by that much again, then it's supposed to increase the temperature by the same amount. In reality, that's not what happens. It's not a linear response. As you can see in this graph I made based on the temperature measurements at different settings, the dial has much less effect at the hotter end of the range than at the cooler end. Keep in mind that while the temperature response curve of your iron might have the same shape, the numbers are likely to be different, so don't use this graph as a guide to setting your temperature. A better way of thinking about this dial is that it's cool at one end, hot at the other, and you should probably ignore the numbers completely. To find a good temperature, first set it to the middle of the range and let the iron sit for about 10 minutes so the temperature settles down. These irons take a long time to heat up, so don't rush this. Then grab a couple scraps of fabric about this size and try ironing them together. For now, use 2 pieces of the same type of fabric, or a single piece folded in half, with the TPU layers facing each other. For these tests, we only need short seams, maybe 2 iron lengths long, just long enough so we can be sure that it's not just the area under the center of the iron that's being welded. After the seam is done, we're going to pull it apart, but first we need to wait for it to cool. If the TPU is still hot, it'll be easy to pull the pieces apart, even if your iron is set to the right temperature, and you're doing everything else correctly, so wait for it to cool until it's no more than warm to the touch. This is what happens if you pull the pieces apart when the iron's temperature setting is good, but the TPU is still hot and partially melted. So allow it to cool, and then try to peel the fabric pieces apart. We can see here that the fabric pieces are sort of stuck together, but they can be pulled apart without too much effort. The TPU might turn kind of whitish as you force the pieces apart, but if TPU isn't ripping away from the woven fabric, then the TPU layers haven't fused into a single layer, and it's not a good weld. When the TPU layers can still be separated after ironing, that means we need to raise the iron's temperature. At this point, we could try it at maybe 3/4 power or the maximum setting. Just take a guess based on the results of your first test. Whenever you change the setting, you need to wait for the temperature to stabilize. I always give it at least 10 minutes to settle down, because if the temperature is still changing when you do these tests, you'll just be chasing it up and down and you'll never find a good setting. So after you move the dial, go do something else for a bit. Okay, let's give this a try. Now I'm just doing the same thing as before, ironing for about 8 or 10 seconds and then pressing the fabric with a silicone roller before ironing the adjacent area. If you don't have a roller, you can use a rag or even your sleeve, but the roller is nice because it allows the fabric to cool down faster than it would if you covered it with a rag, and rollers are pretty cheap. Okay, we've ironed this together and let it cool down, so now let's pull it apart. If the weld is too strong for you to peel it by hand, just cut it into thinner strips so you can force them apart. The strength of a seam against this peeling force is directly proportional to its length, so if you cut it in half, it'll require half as much force to pull it apart. Because we're focusing all the peeling force on the edge of the weld, the width of the weld this way doesn't really matter. We can see that it's much better. The TPU layers have fused together in a few spots, but not everywhere, so we need to increase the temperature a bit more. This time I'll try the maximum setting. When you're welding two pieces of the same type of fabric together, when you pull them apart, ideally you want to see the TPU coming off in patches that are stuck to both surfaces. That indicates that the TPU coatings have fused into a single layer that is still strongly and equally bonded to both pieces of fabric. This doesn't always happen though, so if everything else looks good, but the TPU is peeling off preferentially from only one of the fabric pieces, you could try reducing the temperature a bit, but as long as it's difficult to pull the welds apart, it's probably fine. Once you've found the right setting, place a piece of tape over the adjustment dial so you won't turn it accidentally. My experiments have shown that there's a pretty wide range of iron temperatures that will produce good welds. None of my irons will get so hot as to be completely unusable, but as the temperature increases above the optimal range, you'll notice that the fabric tends to wrinkle and shrink more noticeably when the iron is applied, and the TPU will fully liquefy instead of just partially melting, which you can notice because the fabric tends to slide sideways more easily when you apply any sideways pressure. Subjecting the fabric to excessively high temperatures will start to break down the bond between the woven fabric and the TPU layers, and it will also break down the polymers that make up the individual strands of yarn, so higher than optimal iron temperatures will weaken both the individual pieces of fabric and also the bonds between them. After the temperature is dialed in and you get the hang of this technique, you might start to develop a feel for the timing so you won't actually have to count out the seconds anymore. But until you reach that point, I do recommend counting because it ensures your welds will be consistent. Removing the heat too early will have the same effect as having the iron set too cold, weak welds that might fail. Ironing in one place for much longer than necessary will start to weaken the fabric. 1 1000, 2 1000, 3 1000. Let's see how that is. Yeah, that was only 3 seconds, and you can see it pulled apart easily, and the TPU is still stuck to both of these. It's not welded together. So let's try that again. Let's try 4 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, 4 seconds. Appears to be a good weld. And I'm not counting those seconds with a clock or a stopwatch or anything, I'm just counting. So you might count faster, and you might find that with your iron it takes 7. Count to 7 or 8 or whatever. Now this is not a perfect weld. There's a couple spots where I'm able to peel it apart. So yeah, at the ends of the iron. The middle of the iron, it was all pretty good. So let's try 5 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Pull down. Okay, yeah, that's definitely welded. So if I count to 5 or 6, I'm gonna get good welds. To recap, a strong weld between 2 layers of TPU coated fabric requires 2 things: heat and pressure. Heat is the obvious one, but don't forget to apply pressure as the fabric cools. Set the iron's temperature by trial and error by welding scraps of fabric together and then pulling the welds apart to test them. If the iron is the correct temperature, it will make a strong weld in about 5 to 10 seconds, and after the weld is allowed to cool and then pulled apart, the TPU sticks strongly to both pieces of fabric. It's also important to note that the thicker a fabric is, the longer it will take for the bond to form properly. That's because the heat has to transfer through the woven fabric and into the TPU layers below, and the thicker the fabric is, the longer that takes. So if you're making something with very lightweight fabrics, like an ultralight DIY packraft, you won't have to press as long as you would if you're making one of the standard weight DIY packrafts. Thinner fabrics also cool down faster than the thicker fabrics, so in general, heat sealing goes a bit faster with thinner fabrics, and slower when you're working with thicker fabrics. 1/1000 to 1000. You might have noticed that earlier I said the welded seams are actually stronger than the woven fabric, but here we are able to pull the welds apart without ripping the fabric, and I'm claiming that these are good welds. So what's up with that? Well, none of the seams in a DIY packraft are actually made like this. Anytime there's an area with a peeling force applied, the seam is reinforced with an additional piece of fabric across this area, like so, and that prevents the weld from peeling apart. Other seams are simply overlapped like this, so there's no peeling force applied, only a shear force. In one of my old videos, I demonstrated how I could hang my whole body weight from a 1-inch strip of fabric with an overlap weld like this, and when it broke, it was the woven fabric that ripped, not the weld. That's why I can confidently say that additional sewing or gluing wouldn't make these seams any stronger. The seams aren't the weakest point. In less critical areas, such as the DIY packraft seats and backrests, there are some seams that do experience peeling forces like this, but they're still more than strong enough. For example, I can stand on an inflated backrest. When the welds are done properly, the seams hold up just fine. If you're designing something for yourself, it's important to take into account the geometry of the seams and all the forces that will be applied, because it's easy to unintentionally introduce weak points into your design, or to focus all the forces on a single point, both of which can have bad consequences. You might notice that there's a slight color change or darkening as you weld the fabric pieces together, and the lighter colored fabrics especially start to look wet when they're welded. I want to caution you not to use this color change as a sign that you're making good welds, because the color change also happens when the fabric pieces are barely stuck together and there's no weld at all. So at best, you can sometimes use a lack of color change as a sign that there's no weld, but it doesn't follow that if you do see a color change, then there is a good weld. When you're using darker fabrics, this wet look isn't as apparent, and some people have concluded that it's easier to work with lighter colored fabrics because it's easier to see the color change. But given the fact that the color change isn't a reliable indicator of good welds, that shouldn't be a reason for you to choose lighter colored fabrics, and it could actually lead you into falsely believing that your welds are good, even when they're not. The DIY Packraft projects incorporate a mix of fabrics, some that are coated with TPU on only one side, and others that are coated on both sides, like these ones. Notice that the finish on this one is a little bit different on each side, with one side being glossier than the other. Don't let that confuse you, they're both TPU coatings. As I've already mentioned, we can't iron directly on the TPU, so anytime we're working with a fabric that is coated on both sides, we also have to incorporate a fabric that is only coated on one side, and that's the fabric that we press with the iron. Whenever you're ironing something to a fabric that is coated on both sides, remember to place a piece of parchment paper beneath it, in case you accidentally iron in one place for too long and the TPU on the underside starts to melt. The way to avoid that is to only iron in one place long enough to weld the upper TPU layers together, and then remove the iron before the heat transfers through to the bottom TPU layer. This iron is hot enough to make good welds on the standard weight DIY Packraft fabrics after about 8 seconds, and I can actually hold it here in one spot for more than 15 seconds before it starts to melt the TPU on the underside of this double-coated fabric, so there's plenty of margin for error. Practice on scraps of fabric and pull the welds apart to determine the minimum time it takes to make a complete weld, as I demonstrated with the single-sided fabrics, and also determine the maximum amount of time you can hold the iron in one place without melting the TPU on the underside of the double-coated fabric, and keep that in mind as you're constructing your project. On the thinner ultralight fabrics, the margin between a good weld and melting the bottom layer of TPU is narrower, but it's still not difficult to do. Note that it's normal for the TPU on the ultralight fabric to change texture somewhat, but it shouldn't melt. In either case, practice on scraps of fabric before starting on your Packraft to make sure you've got the timing right. If you're having trouble making welds without melting the TPU on the underside of the fabric, then your iron is probably too hot. It also helps to avoid always ironing over the same spot on your table, because if you do that, eventually the table will get quite hot, and in effect you'll be heating the fabric from below as well as from the iron. When you apply heat to the fabric, it can shrink a tiny bit. Not enough to mess up the design of your project, but enough that if you start welding a seam at both ends, and then try to work towards the middle, there's a good chance you'll end up with a fold or a wrinkle there. So always iron outwards from a single point, either starting at one end of the seam and working towards the other end, or starting in the middle and working out from there in both directions. On a straight, flat seam, where the position of the fabric is important, I usually tack it down in several spots with the edge of my iron so it can't move around as I'm ironing. For the most part, this seems to prevent the shrinkage from happening, and if necessary, I can reheat those tacked areas and gently pull the fabric apart and reposition it. Speaking of repositioning the fabric, if after welding a seam you realize that you've made a mistake and welded something in the wrong place, it's often possible to reheat the fabric with your iron and carefully peel the pieces apart, starting at one end of the seam and slowly working along it, heating as you gently peel. If the fabric pieces come apart such that there's still TPU covering both pieces of fabric, then it's possible to reuse those pieces. But if there are significant areas where the TPU has completely peeled off from one of the fabrics, then it's better to get a replacement part, because the TPU isn't like a glue that will bond to fabric that isn't already coated with TPU. Once the TPU comes off of the woven fabric, you can't just heat it up and stick it back on. The TPU has to be bonded to the fabric during the manufacturing process. That's also why you can't weld these fabrics to fabrics that don't have a TPU coating, and you can't weld the TPU coated side of the fabric to the non-TPU coated side. It will form a weak bond, as I mentioned before, but it's not strong enough to be useful for anything. I tend to design things with seams that are much wider than necessary. So if you have to unweld a seam and you end up with some small areas where the TPU is missing, there's a good chance the piece will still be usable. If you're unsure about something like this, just send me a picture and I'll tell you whether or not I think it's safe to use it, or if you should start with a new piece. If necessary, I can make a replacement part for you. But it's always easier and faster if you do things right the first time, so before you start welding each new piece in place, always double check the instructions to make sure you've got the right pieces and they're oriented correctly. When you start ironing curved edges together, like the tube-to-tube seams in a Packraft, You'll find that the fabric won't lie flat on your table, and you'll need to drape it over something like an overturned bowl or a wooden form like these ones. If you want to use a bowl, choose one that doesn't have a lip around the bottom so you can press the iron flat against it. Draw a center line on your form, and to hold the fabric in place while you work, wrap some masking tape around it, sticky side out. Then you can line up the two fabric edges with the center line and join them together with a seam strip. I've got the iron overhanging the edge a little bit, and I've already sealed the other side, so I'm concentrating on this side, and I'm slowly moving the iron, but I don't know if you can see it in the camera, but I can see a little bit of melted TPU starting to squeeze out the side, and as soon as I see that, I move on. I'm just rocking the iron. Now I have to remember not to go too far. And I see it squeezing out the side there, perfect. Okay, and I'm just gonna give that a roll. And it's really important to let this cool before I lift it off of the form here. It can be warm to the touch, but if it's really hot, then the TPU might start to separate from the two pieces of fabric as you do this, because you're peeling it off of the masking tape. And you will get little bits of tape residue on the fabric, and that's okay. You can wash it off later or just leave it on if you don't care about it. It rubs off fairly easily. The way that I do this is I start by sealing, pressing the iron in the middle of the seam strip along the center line, and then I'll move it over to one edge so it's either right on the edge or even overhanging a millimeter or so. And then I wait to see that TPU squeezing out the side and making sure I'm not going too far. And now I'm going to come and do this far side here. So you can probably see that the side of the iron that's closest to the camera is lifted up slightly, because it's really this far side that I'm pressing on. And as you're repositioning the fabric here, you want to keep this tail in line with the center line on your form. If it's off to one side, then that's going to create kind of a weird curve in the seam, so keep everything aligned. I do sell these forms in the DIY Packraft shop, but you can easily make your own if you have some basic woodworking tools. Your packraft, or whatever it is you're making, will be rolled and folded many times throughout its lifetime, so it's important to make sure your welds hold up to those forces. It's much easier to check this as you work than to finish your project and then realize you have to go back and re-weld everything. What you want to do is manipulate it, make sure it's not lifting or peeling anywhere. Run your fingernail along the edge. I can see that I didn't weld all the way to the edge of this strip in this little section here. The rest of it looks pretty good. So I'll just go over this area again. It's better to have the iron overlap a little bit and melt a little bit of the TPU beyond the edge of the strip here. It doesn't do any damage to it, but if you leave things like that hanging out, they can get caught and it can start to peel. If you accidentally touch the TPU with your iron and you suspect that the airtight waterproof membrane may be perforated, the easiest way to fix it is to weld a scrap of fabric over the melted area like this. If you use a matching color, then it isn't really noticeable. Or you can use a contrasting color and cut the patch into an interesting shape, so it looks like an intentional decoration. Some people have also repaired small areas of damaged TPU by scraping bits of TPU from scrap fabric and then welding them over the damaged area with a piece of parchment paper between the TPU and the iron. Another option is to coat the damaged area with seam grip or aqua seal. That's all for this video. Thanks for watching.